Hi, everyone. Welcome to Office Hours. If you are watching on YouTube, you can find out more about what we do at officehours.global. Our first hour is general discussion about media production, and our second hour is usually something we want to spend a little bit more time on. And today, we're going to talk about networking troubleshooting. This is something that all of us run into nowadays. It's not, you don't really pick up almost any of our gear without having to connect it to the internet or connect it to each other over a network. So we're going to talk about those. So if you've got questions about networking, you're trying to figure something out, throw those in, make sure to tag them in Mokana. And if you're not in Mokana, you can still ask questions. The way to ask questions is go to askofficehours.com. Works 24/7 for general questions. It's right there. You can use that QR code as well. So if you want to try that, go ahead and throw that in, throw your questions into there, and we'll get them into the show. We had Blackmagic had a little presentation yesterday, and there's a lot of questions about it. So we thought we'd just move all the questions from Blackmagic up to the front, get through them all, and then move on to our regularly scheduled program. So let's go ahead and jump into the questions. Bill, what do we or Jason, what do we have?
Yeah.
TJ Asher in Minneapolis, Minnesota writes in Blackmagic Cinema Camera 6K. Note, no pocket on this one. Full frame 35mm sensor, but lacks built-in NDR filters like the Pocket 6K Pro. What are your thoughts on specs, and are there any panelists going to chase some delicious bokeh with this camera?
Go ahead, Jesse.
I think that was a surprisingly incremental upgrade to the Pocket line. The dropping of the Pocket moniker feels cosmetic, and it's a day one purchase for me.
It looks pretty good. I mean, I think that one of the things, the full frame is something a lot of us were waiting for. So I think that the hard part with full frame is that full frame really requires a lot of effort if you don't have good autofocus. So those two things go together if you're a small producer. And again, I think that where Blackmagic is having a little bit of, they got to find themselves, is that they're building a camera that is kind of halfway in between. It's got a full frame sensor, but not autofocus. It's got, it also doesn't have a global shutter. It's also not kind of a box camera. We talked about it later. And so when they say they want to do it as a high-end professional, there's a lot of the way it's built makes it harder to do that. And so it's kind of this they're kind of in this in-between. The images look amazing, and especially when you look at a $2,500 camera, there are not many $2,500 full frame cameras. And I will say that the full frame will fix things for a lot of people, especially if you're planning to use external focus tools, which you would do in a cinema camera. Go ahead, Bill.
Well, I just also think it was interesting what it does have and what it doesn't have. And I kept thinking to myself, who's the target for this? And it came to me that it's really the young resume filmmakers and people who want to be in the cinematic movie making arena. This is not going to be a good corporate camera. I don't think it's not going to be a good run and gun camera. It's not going to be good for news and things like that. But for the person who wants to make the resume movie and have it look fabulous and yet still spend very little money, the fact that it has all those instant shims that Gran was showing about putting into different lens systems tells me that they're making this for whatever you've got. If you want to be a young filmmaker, this is your camera. That's where I saw it targeted.
Go, Tom.
I'm really happy to see that with the L mount, they've come in with that very low depth flange, and you can adapt to just darn near anything. I think it's going to be very versatile.
Go, Courtney.
Yeah, with the variety of mounts, especially for PL, I can see this being used, made up to use Panavision lenses as a crash cam or a C cam or a D cam and a multicam shoot on a professional Hollywood film. So it'd be a good, cheap way to put an expensive lens in danger and not risk too much camera.
My brother has worked on quite a few films where he said the Blackmagic cameras, the current 6Ks, have been used for crash cams, and they've been really successful and cut quite well with the Aries. So it just depends on how you manage the color correction later. Go ahead, Mitchell.
What Bill said resonates with me because a lot of film school graduates used to have to buy a red and give their life away to own it. I think there's a cost of entry has dropped substantially, so a lot more people are going to have a chance to do cinema production with a lot lower price tag to get into it, and then grow from there based on their performance.
Go, Chris.
Yeah, Bill, it was interesting. You said resume film. I was like, what do you mean by that? And then it dawned on me. But when you said that, I was thinking of Vincent Laforet and his first Canon 5D video, Reverie. I think we should make a movie as a group and just call it Resume.
The original Memento, I think, was a resume film and started Christopher Nolan. Everybody went, wow. And the next thing you know, he's directing the biggest movies of all time.
Yeah. And I want to be clear that I own, owns, I think 9 or 10 of these cameras of the last generation, the first generation of the 6K cameras, not even the pros or the newer ones. And we've shot a lot of pretty good footage with it. It's been pretty usable footage and it looks good. Where you start to have issues, number one is while it seems like a feature to have it is a nice thing to have the monitor on the back because you can just set up and start to shoot. The downside of that is that you just worry about it all the time while you're building rigs because you got this piece of glass sitting around you that you have to kind of manage. And the form factor, really the form factor for filmmaking has really become box cameras. We just want a sensor box that has some I/O to it, and then we want to build something around it. And I hope that Blackmagic, I personally hope that they just replace the Ursas with a box camera and use this camera as this is the cinema camera with that. And I think that they have these studio cameras that they've been building, that they've been putting out. The new Ursa with the Super 35 that really has this kind of studio build for it. I think that's the right direction for them. And so I think that what I see possibly coming is you see this cinema camera, you then see the broadcast kind of cameras that have the big screen and they've got a bunch of things that are Super 35. And then you end up with a box camera that's full frame sensor or even larger than full frame sensor. We see some of those in the higher end cameras, and it's pretty useful. Go ahead, Jesse.
Bill, I do have to push back a little bit. I disagree that these cameras don't. I absolutely feel like the Blackmagics are excellent run and gun cameras if you approach all filmmaking from a fully manual standpoint. The extra latitude you get with RAW allows us to take these out and shoot really dirty and then do a lot of correction in post. But that's because we always shoot fully manual. And if you're shooting fully manual, a Sony isn't that different from a Blackmagic in terms of how it operates in your hand.
Yeah,
that's
100%.
A fair point. I will say that the form factor of this surprised me because it's very much that DSLR form factor that's got the kind of battery thing. So that's great for a DSLR shooter because you can hang the camera down, run and gun with it and things like that. I'm surprised actually that they kept this form factor for this set of needs.
I think that the approach there was really looking at the fact that people have a lot of accessories and they really wanted to let people say, hey, you can upgrade to this full frame sensor without having to rebuild your entire kit. But I don't think that would have stopped very many people. To be honest, if the price point was $500 more and we had a box camera with global shutter, I think they'd sell twice as many, because it's just, we suddenly have, and even without the autofocus, by the way, super hard. What Sony's doing is really hard. But if you're trying to go towards YouTube, and I think that if you look at some of the stuff, when they keep on saying you can shoot your TikToks, you can shoot vertical, you can shoot these things, they're definitely aiming at that market. They're aiming at this social market. When you see the job listings for Final Cut Pro, and how many are looking for iOS, these two companies are really fighting hard for that social market, that social media production market. But that requires the social media production market requires autofocus, and so that's why Sony has made so many inroads. And to be honest, Sony's outreach programs are insanely good. That's the other part of it is they have all these Sony camps and stuff like that for influencers. Next question.
Tlaloc Lopez Waterman, this time in Norfolk, Virginia. In the Blackmagic announcement yesterday, did you get a sense of whether the Blackmagic camera on iPhone can ingest time code, or is it just using the phone clock?
Chris?
I do not see any way to get time code into it, but it does have the choice of record run time code or time of day, and I can't imagine what barbarian on the planet would do record run. I mean, time of day is just so much better.
Go bring it up. Go ahead, Mitchell.
Yeah, I'm just thinking that obviously it's going to have great synchronous time code to the video because it's going to be in the metadata that goes out to the file. But getting it in and out, there's no gazintas and gazautas on an iPhone allows that to happen.
Courtney?
Well, there could be. It could use Bluetooth because Tentacle has a Bluetooth timecode generator. And if somebody writes the software or the hooks into this software, it could use the microphone in Bluetooth channel to send timecode in as long as the software could handle it.
Bill?
Yeah, and if the port is bidirectional, there's no reason the Tentacle or something else couldn't come up with a USB-C solution to inject timecode into the computer. So hold on, wait and see.
Chris?
I just noticed that nobody said iPhone 15 yet, so I needed to say that. And then also,
Just say it. Just say it randomly. iPhone.
I did. And so I think
This is brought to you by the iPhone
what's
15
most
and the
amazing
new
about
5X
this
lens.
iPhone app is that, and I said this to Alex yesterday, Blackmagic Sherlocked Filmic, and Apple wasn't even part of the equation.
Yeah, I mean, I think there might be questions about this in the future, but I guess since we're talking about the iPhone app here, that was just a daisy cutter. Like just I mean, they just dropped a bomb on every company making phone any kind of app for the phones is gone. Like it is like it. I couldn't. I was just yeah.
Did you have any idea this might be like a thing?
No comment.
When
But
you
the,
pulled the phone out, I was like, "What?"
So, but I will say that this is just such an incredible. The problem is it's integrated with Resolve. It's uploading to the Blackmagic cloud. It has all the tools that you want. It has the interface that is very similar to the other cameras. It is like I just don't understand how Filmic survives this, to be honest. And we've been friends with Filmic. We've had them on the shows, but I don't know how they get how they get around this. Go ahead, Grant.
Chris just wants to jump in again. Something about not knowing if you knew about it ahead of time. Alex, what I love is whether you did or didn't, just saying no comment is so classy. Like it's such a cool response. What I find with the app is it feels like a version 2 already. That's what was amazing to me is all the settings, everything that's kind of built out in it. It doesn't feel like a beta. I didn't say it was a beta. And to your point as well, Alex, about it being the same kind of interface. So if you're familiar with their cameras, then you're learning this as well. And so you could throw this at someone who has never used a Blackmagic camera, play around with this for a little while, and then you'll be familiar with some of the interfaces of Blackmagic cameras.
And the fact that it's going to carry all that color data and metadata and potentially depth data and all these other things right into Resolve with it is a pretty profound opportunity. And I just don't understand how anyone would do it. And I think that this development probably happened around when Filmic did the subscription because with Jeff Bezos, they say your margin is my opportunity. He was quoted as saying that, and Grant is notorious for feeling like subscriptions are repugnant. And I can just see him just like seeing the Filmic thing and deciding your subscription is my opportunity, and I think that he went, I personally think that he went, I have no information about that, but I think that would be probably when my eyes would light up like, hey, I could do something. Go ahead, Chris.
I want to say something briefly about the Save Clips To menu. About putting it to the cloud. I texted as soon as Grant said that. I texted Alex. I was like, "Okay, you got my attention, Grant Petty." Being pretty much, I don't like Resolve, but not as an editor. I think the idea of clips just magically appearing in a bin is problematic because I want to know what's going into my project. It's a little bit of sour grapes there, but I'd almost rather have it just go to my hard drive. But with the thing, you don't have to go straight to the cloud. You can pick any folder, shared folder. And so we set up a iCloud shared folder, and I can put the clips right into that iCloud shared folder. So it doesn't have to go straight into the bin, but it does magically show up on my editor across on the other side of the planet.
Do you think that announcement from yesterday with the bigger buckets was a part of that? Because iCloud now has bigger accounts.
I don't think it was part of it. I think it's just
No,
Apple realized that a lot of people are shooting in ProRes now. I think that also the as a news gathering device, this just took a huge jump. Like, so if you're an editor in Resolve and to go back, it's going into your bins as someone's doing news coverage, that becomes a pretty profound way to make a fast turn. You have a camera with a cellular connection able to dump files as they're shooting from the Ukraine or from, wherever. It's a game changer. Go ahead, Courtney.
Yeah, what I think they did is they just took the Blackmagic 5-inch 12K video assist code and user interface and everything in there, and then piped the iPhone camera into that, and it'd be an easy ARM translation. So that's why it looks so familiar, and all the controls look the same as the video assist, and it's an easy transition. But they added the cloud stuff.
And the reality is that the hardest part of building software oftentimes is figuring out what to do, not how to do it, especially when they've already done it once. So the interface, by not changing the interface very much, and we have to remember that, Blackmagic's a big company. They've got a lot of programmers. So anything that they decide to point towards, we think of them, we're not conscious to it because they don't show us their headquarters very often, but there's a lot of people down there working. So the numbers I've heard thrown around and informally they probably have about 3 times as many programmers working on Resolve than Adobe has on Premiere. So it's so I think that it's and so it's a pretty big staff. Go ahead, Jason.
Far and away, my favorite thing about this app is that by default, right, you plug it in here, and if I put that lead in, you're seeing. Keep in mind it's vertical, right? And then when I switch it horizontal, it goes vertical again, and if that is the default behavior, which makes such a difference when you're trying to deal with this stuff.
Go, Bill.
Very quickly, yesterday's show, Calvin Roberts, which was a fabulous show, and you should all go back and watch that. He's talking about how he had to schlep all this gigantic gear. This completely eviscerates that. And having worked in ENG, electronic news gathering, for a group that did TV stations, I don't think anything other than pocket smartphones are going to be capturing news in the very short future. The idea of having to go out with a full crew to do something other than maybe a sit-down interview where you want it to be lit perfectly, gone.
I lived mostly in D.C. for a couple months in 2019 or 18, and all you saw were these all the foreign news. They were all out there with iPhones, and they would literally set the thing down, and they'd stand back and hold a mic and talk into the camera and go. It was all one person just giving hits from different parts of D.C. It was kind of, and only a couple of years before that, they had a camera crew and an audio person and everything else. Now it's just a reporter that knows how to use an iPhone. To go back to the question of timecode, you can always get timecode in if you drop it into the right channel as an audio input. So we've used that for years. So you could do it and still have your mic on one side and your audio coming in on the other. Next question.
Alexander Knight in Port Coquitlam, BC, Canada. Thoughts on Blackmagic live stream event from Thursday? Lots of really great products, but what other problems are you looking for them to solve?
Go ahead, Grant.
I mean, just in general, the announcement was really interesting in this week of having other announcements that are happening, particularly Apple, and they had these skits that happened, and they had all this kind of fanfare that happens that Apple does that we enjoy. And here's a good Aussie, another Grant, who just gets on and says, "Hey, I'm Grant from Blackmagic, and let's get straight into it." It was like 14 seconds of intro, and he was like, "Okay, we've got a new router. It's 80 by 80." And, it was like, there's the update. And it was like, he just bang, 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 there it is. And no extra marketing or anything. It was just, I think it's the Aussie in him, but he's so practical. And I also think that the pricing of their products is set in that way that there isn't a bunch of extra marketing, bloat in their pricing, and so I think that makes a big difference. But yeah, it was great to see SRT, which was very interesting to see that in the web presenters, that it was just kind of sitting there, that they could do that sort of encoding or rewrapping it and make that work. But interesting that they couldn't do 265 encoding on the web presenter HDs, but they can on the 4K, which says that they had it kind of sitting there. They've got a 265 encoder on the chip, just kind of sitting there waiting for them to do a firmware upgrade and release that. That's a pretty cool thing that Blackmagic does do, that there's things sitting there waiting to be sent out. But I guess I was hoping to see PTZs and, all that sort of stuff, but one day maybe.
I will say, after watching both of the keynotes, I think that for me, the Blackmagic keynote was better than the Apple keynote for probably 1/100th of the cost. So I felt, so the Apple keynote came down to, hey, we've got a great new camera. And like everything else to me was just kind of like, okay, and the first half an hour was a complete waste of my time, and I think that Apple just filled it with a lot of fluff. And I think that they had very little to talk about, and they, the phone, the watch was a minor upgrade, which is great if you're thinking of buying an Ultra. But they spent an enormous amount of time on something that just was not that big of a deal. Most of the upgrades for the iPhone were, incremental, which is fine. The camera has me buying the camera, buying the. That's what all of us look for, is the camera, and then we just go and move on. So I think Apple put a lot of great production value into it, but I felt like that I was much more rapt, looking at all the things that Grant was doing, and he does them so subtly, and he does them so just kind of like, okay, now I'm going to show you this thing, and every once in a while I was like, what? Like, what? So for a lot of these things, there was just a lot of jumping out at it. I think he cut over that router pretty quickly, because a lot of us have been, we harangue every person we talk to at Blackmagic of, I need something bigger than a 40x40 12G. And it is this, I think he just was like, okay, fine, here's your router. Now I'm going to move on. I think that he doesn't care. I don't think Grant cares about the routers. So I think he was like, here you go. And now I'm going to move on to the things I'm interested in, which are cameras.
It's got a nice chuck. It's got a chuck in the knob. It's really, feel that. That's really
exactly.
Nice.
Tell us about that clutch one more time.
Those are the things he likes. But the router itself, I just felt like we couldn't get anybody at Blackmagic. We got people's attention, because we were just talking about it all the time. Like, I'm just dying here, for an 80x80, or I wanted obviously a bigger one. But we have a 72x72 that was stuck to 1080p because of that, and we would have bought 100% would have bought the 80x80, which I think is actually less expensive than the 72 that we got, because it's the old fashioned big one that has cards and stuff like that. So anyway, but I think it was a really, really great. I think it's just a great demo. I don't think there was a lot of fat in it. I think he just walked through and explained what the things were. I always think the cameras don't quite match, which is funny because they make cameras. But I think that they're always pretty close. And it has this weird thing where you feel like they recorded it, but then it feels live like they didn't quite. I don't know whether they're adding kind of the imperfection to it or not, but it feels a little either forced or just not quite finished. Go ahead, Courtney.
Yeah, I was really surprised by the fact that there was no mention of 2110. The only products that they even have now with that on it is the Decklink IPs. There's 3 new ones of those, and they didn't even mention those, I don't think. They've been out, I think, for a while, but that really surprised me. And the fact that the new consoles didn't mention really much of the interface differences. They did mention on the big production hubs, the big routers, that they changed the internal structure so that you can replace one row of SDI inputs if something goes bad, which has always been a problem with those, because once the connector fails or one of the input fails on one of the inputs, it's write it off. Don't use this input anymore until and it couldn't be fixed in the past. You didn't want to, turn that thing into a boat anchor, because 3 of them go dead.
So we had one of the older ones, and someone had stepped on one of the cables, and we had to put a sticker over it that said 40x39. We had a piece of tape over it. so it was that was one of the older ones. But the larger routers that they had, the 72x72s and the 144x144s, had those cards in them.
Removable cards.
Yeah, those are the removable cards, so we could swap them, and we have Jesse.
Not only did the cameras not match, they kept crossfading between them, which felt like a relic of 70s, 80s public broadcasting. It was a very odd choice. Grant is so good at building trust. It blows my mind every time. He just slips little turns of phrases in throughout that make me just feel like all in on the company. And the one that caught me on this was every time he talked about a bug on this broadcast, he kept going, "Yeah, so that was really annoying, and we fixed it." And I appreciate his candor so much.
I just think that that's one of the reasons that the Blackmagic keynote is better than the Apple ones now, is just because there's a level of authenticity. This is the owner of the company, and it really is. Blackmagic is an expression of Grant Petty. It's and this is his baby. These are the things that he cares about, and he's here to share them with you. Is incredibly powerful. Like, just an incredibly powerful way to approach it. When you have all these big companies that he's competing with that are just kind of faceless, giant companies with people who do these things. There's something about having, it feels like you're dealing with a small company, even though it's a massive company. It just feels very like them. There's just some kind of parasocial relationship there that builds up. Go ahead, Chris.
Alex, I got the sense, I agree, the cameras didn't match well, and the dissolve was ridiculous. But did you feel that the pop ins and outs was the same angle, or were those two cameras very close to each other? I think it was the same sensor, same lens.
I don't know for sure. I thought that it was two separate cameras that were really near each other, and I didn't understand why. Like, I thought that they maybe had a wide and a close next to each other, and they were popping between the two, and not having it. And I couldn't. And then I also couldn't decide whether they had recorded this a couple times and were jump cutting. I
don't think they were jump cutting between different takes. The dialogue was too smooth. It was too smooth to be.
Right.
Unscripted dialogue, to be able to do that, super hard to do. Super hard to do. But almost immediately, I thought, oh, they're going to show a box that is one camera in, two framings out.
Oh,
like I thought that's what they were going to be announcing. But the two different feeds, I think it was the same image sensor. I think some new director kid said, "Hey, watch this, Grant. I'm going to do this." And
those aren't hard to do. I mean, if you're doing only 1080p, you run it into the switcher, and then you convert one down. If only you had enough Teranexes to do this, so to make that happen. Go ahead, Mitchell.
Yeah, if he wants me to trust him just a little bit more, a jump cut would be nice.
Next question.
Tony Mobley in Noonan, Georgia writes in, with the new BMD camera app for iOS devices, can it be controlled by the ATEM Mini?
I will say not yet, but I wouldn't put it out of the question. There's no reason why, if you're sending this IP information, you couldn't do it. And I don't know if I don't know if we have a question about this later, but notice that there's a REST API for the new cameras. Ooh, that means you can change all the settings from the web. That means that the camera, if you can plug into the new cameras with USB-C and go out to Ethernet, and you can change settings in that camera. For those of us who have been using these cameras as remote cameras, that's a big deal. So I don't think most people would see it, but if I'm sending out kits to people, that's why O90 has so many of these cameras, is we built kits that we'd send out. And the hardest thing that we had to do with that camera was we had to send a whole switcher just to control the camera, because we couldn't get to it any other way but through the switcher to shade it and everything else. Now, I'm going to theoretically be able to see the camera and be able to shade the camera and do all the other things that theoretically, we don't know how deep the REST API is, but theoretically I can change LUTs, I can change other things, change all the settings. All of those things can be changed in my head until we see the API from a REST command, which is powerful. Go ahead, Courtney.
Yeah, I'm not sure how they'd get the data information back over the HDMI unless they use an audio return.
No, it's you through USB-C. So there's a USB-C in the camera, and you can use the USB-C as a controller.
Oh, okay. But its output would come into the ATEM Mini over what?
Over HDMI. But
over the network.
But I'm saying that we do a lot of things where we don't have an ATEM Mini. Anyway, I jumped out. But you mean for the BMD camera? Well, it can talk over the network.
That's what I'm saying. This question is, does the camera app allow it to be controlled from the ATEM Mini? And I was going to say, how would they get the control signals back into the app?
Because now you've
got the USB-C to HDMI output. on it.
But the the panels and the switchers all talk to each other over IP. So there's no reason why you couldn't set something up where it was talking to the camera outside
That's
of the
true. It
HDMI.
could go
It doesn't
over
need to have
Wi-Fi. Could go over
doesn't need to come
Wi-Fi,
back to it.
Exactly. Yeah.
And you could also have a camera converting to the Ethernet and go into the newer switchers with Ethernet. Go ahead, Bill.
Since there's cameras now in a stereoscopic array, how much time before we can get just turn both cameras on and give me a wide and a medium out of those two cameras?
Yeah, and
Down one pipe.
with the new studio camera, we built rigs. I was spelunking the other day in the garage, and I found I actually have a rig for those little production cameras for stereo. So I'm gonna dust them off and see if I can get two of those cameras to shoot some stereo. Next question.
Douglas Carmichael writes in, Grant mentioned that the BMD 80x80 video hub was designed to be repaired with each channel on an individual card. Is this a response to the right to repair laws, and will we see more of this from BMD in the future?
Go, Jesse.
I think a lot of companies use repairs as an opportunity to nudge customers into a new purchase, and I never got the feeling that Blackmagic does this. They seem to do their repairs fairly close to cost. I don't think that this is in response to right to repair laws. I think this is like fundamental DNA of their company. And this seems to be how they do business. Going back, if you look back, that looks like how they build their equipment. And I imagine looking forward, they're going to continue building their equipment like this.
Go, Jason.
Each channel is not on an individual card. Each row of channels is on an individual
That's four,
card.
right?
And he went,
it's four channels?
I thought it was 8, but he went so far
It's
as
8.
to say straight away that in a pinch you can just open it and switch the boards out. Let's say if you're not using the last row, you can hot swap them up and the card won't care. So no, this has nothing to do with right to repair and everything to do with Grant just flexing about the modularity and ease of repair.
Well, and again, this isn't new for the routers that Blackmagic has made, just new for these more compact ones, because the 72 by 72, 144 by 144, 288s, those all had replaceable cards 4 at a time. So I think that this is just making it, 8 is a little bit of a bummer on my end, because it just means that you're swapping a card out for 8 inputs.
It might be 10. Looking at the back panel.
Oof. I'll go ahead, Mitchell.
I think most engineers would look at that and say the more cross points, the law of averages would work against it, because if it's a motherboard that has a singular backplane on it, more chances of things going wrong. He's just sort of allaying that factor by saying it's modular. It's modular. You can insert another card. You can fix it quickly in the field.
Absolutely. And I don't, as was said earlier, I don't think that there's anything to do with right to repair. That's really around phones and consumer devices and in professional devices. There's no one's talking about right to repair. But I think that it is a little more repairable than Blackmagic has done in the past. Next
John
question.
Deere, isn't that professional? Just a thought.
It's tractors. Tractor. I don't.
Do you have a tractor at your house?
That's a whole nother second hour. I have a lot of opinions about the John Deere thing on both for and pro. I have a friend who actually works on the interfaces for that. So anyway, next question.
Mike Edwards in Brooklyn, New York writes in, Morning, everyone. Did anyone on the panel catch if the new Blackmagic Cinema Camera 6K full frame is lacking camera control similar to the old Blackmagic 12K?
I believe that is the case. So I think that there was something that they insinuated in that discussion. It has to. I think this has to do with the new chips and the new controllers that they had. That the 12K, we thought at some point would be controllable by the switcher. It never became controllable by the switcher, and it never will be. So the 6K, I think that with the 6K, they just declared, hey, we're not going to make the film cameras work the same way as the broadcast cameras, and so we're not shade. You can't shade them. So this is not a new Cinema 6K is not a live camera. Like if you're thinking about using it as a live camera, it is not a live camera. It is built for film, and they want to focus it rather than trying to do a little bit of everything for everyone. I think it's a bummer because I think that I would use it that way, but it's not. You can't. No, go ahead, Jason.
Yeah, Grant's aside on this matter was we've got a lot of room, which means there are probably chips in there that are doing things that have yet to be unlocked. But he straight up said, we saved a lot of space by not putting the shading control in the camera.
Go ahead, Bill.
Yeah, there's a traditional break in cameras between ENG and EFP. Field production, the latter category, is mostly I'm going to execute shots one by one as opposed to needing this. Now, granted, into a live feed, be nice to have these, but I think they're thinking like a cinematographer thinks, where you don't need a lot of external control because everything is set to execute that shot correctly.
Yeah, I think that hopefully that there's good Bluetooth control or something like that. But I will say that when you get an opportunity to work with full frame sensors for live, it's pretty great. so it's a little hard to have the cameras go backwards, in my opinion. But I understand it. I mean, I think that they're moving to that. Again, I think the hard part with doing, and Sony doesn't do it on their smaller cameras either, but global shutter is a big deal for filmmaking. So when you say you have a high-end film camera, you got to really be thinking about global shutter because you do notice it. Shaky cam, put it on a car. You have fast action scenes. You really need global shutter. Go ahead, Courtney.
Yes, Jello Cam. They did introduce for the live stuff the new studio cameras. So they do have new sensors and new inputs and outputs and controls over them. So that was good.
Yeah, no, they're definitely making that adjustment where I think that they're defining these are absolutely studio cameras, these are film cameras. Again, I think that what's missing now is the first attempt was the 12K, but I really think that what we should be thinking, what hopefully Blackmagic's thinking about is a box camera that costs $10,000, $15,000, somewhere in that range, that is larger. Like I think that after Oppenheimer, I think that there is an opportunity for a IMAX size sensor that is like 18K that no one's built yet, and I think Blackmagic is probably the most set up to build that sensor for that. There's this, Oppenheimer kind of changed a lot of things about how we think about
Sony 65 or have a sensor that size.
It's not the same size. They're used for IMAX capture, and they're definitely a larger sensor, but I don't think that they're the full IMAX size sensor. I mean, they are IMAX approved as a digital sensor, but if you want to take advantage of the full IMAX aperture, I believe you're still doing. What was used by Nolan was film cameras to do that. So that's how you capture it for that full size. Next question.
Alexander Knight in Port Coquitlam, BC, Canada. What do you think Blackmagic's reluctance may be to be releasing a box format cinema camera? Why stick to a stills body style?
Good, Chris.
Alex, you said that Blackmagic is really an extension of Grant Petty, and I think that what we see out of Blackmagic is quite often it's sort of the mind of Grant Petty. What does Grant, in Grant's production and business background, feel is a need? And I think the best way to affect change in the Blackmagic ecosystem would be to become a drinking buddy with Grant Petty. Like to just hang out with seriously, to just hang out and expose him to other ways of thinking about things. I think we're always going to see what Grant wants. It's kind of like what would Steve Jobs do? What does Grant want in his production pipeline next?
You go, Jesse.
Sorry, they did release a box format. The Micro Cinema is, I believe, their most honest camera in their entire line since they started making cameras. That feels like the most accurate representation of what the Blackmagic sensor is doing. I'm glad to see the return of the Micro. I think they stick with the stills body because that's where the R&D has been. I do believe that they should have moved away. If they were moving away from the pocket naming, they should have moved away from the body as well. That feels like a pretty big miss.
Yeah, I was really excited about the studio. Man, if that studio was Super 35 or even full, like the thing is the new LX1 from Sony, full frame sensor in a small little body, is really compelling. And so I think that I would have loved to see them move past the 4/3 size. I get it, but I and it's a huge upgrade. Like I used to own, I think 15 of those little guys. And the little changes they made, the regular power, not having to go through a pin, the USB-C input, all the things that and let me tell you, he did say people were a little annoyed with the last the way that the SDIs worked. A little annoyed is the understatement of the world. Like it was, you had to buy, Laird was the only ones, in my opinion, that made connectors for that DIN. It's a DIN 2.3 1.0, I think, or whatever, 3.2 1.0. Laird was the only ones that made them that were easy to get in and on and off of those. And I had hundreds of those cables and we went through lots of different ones to get them. Otherwise you're like sitting there, saying horrible words on set, trying to get the thing off. So just having little SDI, BNCs is great. Mitchell?
Yeah, I think the stills body style, it's the form factor, and people like holding it in their hand. It just feels comfortable if you're going to shoot. So if you're into holding it in your hand, a box camera requires a build out on a tripod and all kinds of other jazz. A form factor that's like a stills camera, just grab it in your hand. You can shoot with it much easier.
Good, Bill.
What both Jesse and Mitchell said resonates with me. The other thing is that you've got a line already that's producing this cage, this body, basically. So making adaptations to it is way quicker to market than starting with a blank piece of paper and designing a brand new form factor for the body. So I think it's just a matter of this was the easiest, fastest, get it out there and make it great path they could take.
Next question.
Oh, let's see. Graham Cardwell in Belfast, Northern Ireland writes in, Blackmagic camera app versus Filmic Pro. Can the free legacy version of the Filmic compete with the new BMD camera app? And can the app be used as a camera source for Zoom?
Chris?
Basically, yeah, asked and answered. I think this kills Filmic. They should just pack up and go, buy a lawnmower and become gardeners. They're done in business. And yes, you can get a clean feed out of the HDMI from the Blackmagic camera and use it in Zoom if you wanted to do that.
And I've experiences of having software that was basically quote unquote Sherlocked in the thing. And the best thing to do is just to save your pennies, just reduce. Like we just immediately moved on. It was we just were like, well, that's it, and we didn't really try to fight at all, and we took our profits and ran.
Is Sherlocking somehow related to jumping the shark? What's the origin of the term Sherlock?
There was a search system that used to be called Sherlock on the Mac, and Apple just released their search system that just completely replaced it. Like it was a third-party app called Sherlock that would, when you hit the space bar or whatever and that little comes up, that's what Sherlock did. And when Apple added it, it Sherlocked them, it killed Sherlock. I mean, it was like that same thing that we just saw here. It was just their market was done, and they complained a little bit, but now that's how it became the term. And that was probably 15 years ago. Go ahead, Courtney.
Yeah, just cut and run. Think of all the money they'll save Filmic and your tech support calls that you can now ignore.
But I don't know, anything that Filmic would add, Blackmagic has just way more engineers. Like it's just, you're just fighting now against a company that has decided this is a market that they want. And there's nothing that you have that, I don't think there's anything they have that would be able to compete with it. Because also, well, anyway, I think that Blackmagic has a pretty close relationship with the manufacturer of the phone. So I just think that's the, I think it's just, there's no way to compete there. Next question.
Douglas Carmichael writes in, do you think we're going to see smaller 4K constellations from BMD soon?
Maybe at NAB. There are, I think that they're definitely looking to compact. I will say that panel was genius. So the panel didn't look like a big change, but a big problem that we have loading into locations is where to put that panel. And having a panel that is not taking up your whole desk, that half rack, was genius. I was, it's not like, I just want to underline, that was a huge upgrade for people that are doing smaller shows, not even smaller shows, it goes wide, but going wide instead of deep is really, really useful for those of us who are on a 30-inch deep table that has other things on it. Yeah, go ahead, Grant.
Yeah, it's also the reach of that too, right? The existing one with, it's like, so I've got the older 1ME advanced panel, and the problem is you just don't have enough buttons. You can shift and things, but you really want the more buttons. So that's an amazing upgrade.
And by the way, it's hidden as a 4ME panel, right? Because it's got the selectors for the 4MEs. It's just that you don't have them all exposed at one time. The other thing that I thought was interesting that if you looked at it carefully, the two panels were talking to the switcher at the same time. So you could have multiples of these all stacked to it basically gives you a way to build a modular 4ME doing what you wanted it to do. Yeah, go ahead, Grant.
Yeah, it's a much better way of doing it because you can have multiple people that have the same sort of access across the different MEs, and we've done that same sort of thing, and we find the 1ME panel is easier to do than having the 2ME or the 4. But to Douglas's question, there is still the old grey production 4K switches that they have apparently still available. So they might roll those in, but I just don't think there's a huge market to go to 4K at like a 20 input or something. I think they've got those HD models now, and then you want to do the 4K, then you pay the extra and you get the 40 inputs, and away you go. So I don't know whether they'll upgrade those older ones or not. They've kind of made this new 4K, 8K, 4K, and HD versions, but that seems like it suits the market.
I used to wish that they'd put more super sources in until we had Mix Effect. Once we had Mix Effect and we were able to very quickly get between super sources, it didn't matter. I'm still amazed that Blackmagic didn't just buy Mix Effect or it like if you have a switcher that has a super source, a Blackmagic switcher that has a super source, and you don't have Mix Effect, you're only getting like a quarter of the switcher. It is literally a 4x multiplier against every one of those. Go ahead, Chris.
Yeah, I will say as somebody who used to switch it, on big switchers, sitting down at a big switcher is kind of cool. I'm not gonna lie. It's pretty dope to sit there and like boom, just a wall, and I'm waiting to see somebody to kind of like pull a sort of, I don't know if this reference hits with everybody. Does everybody know who Daryl Dragon was? He was like
the captain.
The captain from Captain Tennille. I want to see somebody take a stack of those and stack them on a keyboard rack, like 80s rock band, with multiple keyboards. Like, there you go. There's your 4ME stacked high instead of deep.
Yeah.
I'm just saying there's things to explore here.
I mean, one of the things I'd really like to see is a protocol that they have to talk to two switchers at the same time. And the reason for that is really to be able to tie it in for redundancy. So being able to have one panel controlling two switchers would be really useful. There are ways to hack that, but I think Blackmagic should allow you to do that from the ground up.
The problem with that is the little box that you plug the two switchers into that go to the two switchers, that box will break, and now you have so much for redundancy.
Those boxes have broken a lot less often than the switchers. Next question.
Paul Walhus in Austin, Texas writes in, how do you set up your Mac to dual boot to Sonoma or your current OS? And how do you set it to boot from an external drive?
Jason.
Okay, first things first. Although it is possible and you can Google it and find all sorts of videos about how to do this, do not do this with your internal drive. Take this from an expert, please don't do this, or you can get really sideways. Easy way to do it is with an external drive. That's easy because you have good I/O and it's fast enough, so you essentially will just format a high-speed SSD externally, download the beta, and install it on that disk. From there, you hold down the Option key when you're booting. You may have to type in your password in order to get the actual boot. It will come back around, allow you to select your disk, and you will boot from the external disk, and you'll be done.
Next question.
Oleskov Tropovov in Kyiv, Ukraine writes in, what do you think about OBS bot Tail Air? Could it be the game changer for one-man stream teams? What is your opinion about the potential of its particular picture quality through NDI and HDMI?
I think that it's probably going to be fine. I don't think that the NDI and HDMI coming out of that camera specifically will look that dramatically different. So I think that you probably could be able to use that there to make that happen. So I would probably, if I was a one person doing these and you were using a couple of these, I think you're probably now talking about a software switcher like vMix or Memo Live or Ecamm or other things like that you're going to bring a couple of these cameras in, or of course, because it has HDMI, I believe it does have HDMI out, you could put it into a hardware switcher like an ATEM. I don't think you'll lose the controls, I believe, if you do that. The OBSBot, I will say that the OBSBot software on the Mac, if you're using it on a PC, it may work fine. On the Mac, it's a little rough around the edges. So I would probably I'd still lean towards the link right now, unless you're going to be able to take advantage of the OSC controls or API for the OBSBot. I didn't find the software to be particularly compelling on the Mac, but on the PC it could work fine. I just haven't tested it there. Next question.
Eric Hertz in Hartford, Connecticut writes in, does the AWS Elemental Link have an option to send a local server as well as AWS? Can it send multicast stream?
No. It cannot do that. The AWS link is designed to tie into the AWS cloud. It is a very, very mission specific system that is designed to deliver a Zixi plus Elemental secret sauce server defined in code. And what I mean by that is that the when the link ties into AWS tells the link how it wants to get the data, and the link then will send it to it. So it's a server-defined delivery system, and that's really powerful because then you're never having a mismatch between what the encoder is doing and what the servers are expecting. Oftentimes when you see glitches in people's live streams every second or every 3 seconds or every whatever, that's because, for instance, the GOPS aren't lining up. So the server says, I'm expecting 2-second GOPS, and you're sending 3-second GOPS. And what you end up doing is it can't, when it's re-encoding that, you're getting into P frames and B frames where they don't belong. And so your GOPS, for instance, as an example. Now, some encoding systems will make adjustments. It'll say, "Oh, I see what you're doing," and I'll adjust, but not all of them. And so it's more powerful to have the server just say, "This is what I want," and that's how the Clearcaster worked for Facebook as well. It would tie into Facebook, and it would get that information about how it should encode, and then encode it the most efficient for the subsystem. And go ahead, Grant.
Yeah, in theory, that's how it works. My recent testing is kind of in the last week or so has been, I've been having problems with the link where the image is breaking up. To your point, like it's actually getting like lines of blocks and things that are breaking up in the image, and it seems to me like the setting within Media Live is not quite right, because then I can do an RTMP stream from a web presenter. And it's
into AWS, and it's clean.
Into AWS, into Media Live, and it looks great, which has made me think, this is the question that relates back to Blackmagic. Should I just be using the web presenters, which have that beautiful interface, I can monitor that, and do SRT into Media Live? Might be better in this circumstance than the link, that I can't monitor really anything in the same way that I can with a web presenter.
I will tell you that I in fact, I told Elemental, in some meeting somewhere, like, "Hey, look at what Blackmagic's doing on the telemetry on the Blackmagic stuff is really, really good." But I think that the Zixi theoretically is more stable. I don't know why you're having that problem. The one thing that we found has been rock solid, other than the power supply connections for the first generation of the links. The one thing they've been rock solid. You plug them in, you point them, and you go. The only time we've had an issue is when you leave them on for a very long period of time by accident. Not only do you get a large bill, Douglas, I see why you're concerned, because I had to pay that bill. So but you also get you get some errors with audio and so on and so forth. So it doesn't like to be on for, anyway, that's what we found. Anyway, next question.
Jeff Flukiger writes in from Elkhorn, Wisconsin. Remember way back when Apple came out with the parallax effect on iPhone, where if you tilted the phone, you could see the icons move slightly? I wonder if spatial video footage will be viewable on an iPhone and utilize something similar. Thoughts?
Bill?
I can't believe that it wouldn't. Apple, when they program their APIs, particularly like Core Graphics and Core Video and those things, they've built so much of this management of depth perception into those. Remember when we used to get the galleries, and every little icon for your music or whatever had a reflection that was really beautifully rendered? It didn't take a lot of overhead because that code was built into the deepest part of the systems. They've been doing that for 10 years now. So the fact that they will be able to take spatial footage and render it out to phones, the Vision Pro things and everything else without very much overhead at all, I think is a kind of a given.
Courtney?
I doubt it, because that was just a rendering effect that was just shifting the icon layer back and forth over the background. So I don't think you could do it with spatial video. There were 3D phones back in the day, at the turn of the century, 2002 on. There were probably about 20 of them that had lenticular displays on the back of them that would show you a 3D image when you looked at it, and they had 3D cameras on the front of them. Sharp made them, Hitachi made them, Samsung made them. But they were all abandoned fairly quickly within about 2 or 3 years. So I doubt they'll be stepping back into that mess again.
Next question.
Paul Walhus in Austin, Texas writes in, Google has given a small group of companies access to an early version of Gemini AI modeling. This company nears the launch of the GPT-4 rival. Has anyone used Gemini?
Go, John.
Very excited about Gemini. So Google and DeepMind, Google AI, Google Mind, and DeepMind were bifurcated for years. Until 6 months ago, they brought those teams together. And Gemini is the work that DeepMind's been working on for the last 10 years. They were acquired in 2014. And so I really look forward to Gemini. It's an arms race, and we'll be the benefactors.
Next question.
Eric Kurz in Hartford, Connecticut writes in, the new Videon Max encoder can send AWS in a multicast stream. What are your thoughts about using multicast as an IP-based confidence monitor solution rather than NDI or SDI?
I think it depends on how many computers are connecting. I mean, typically multicast gives you an advantage that it's a low hit on the encoder, but you can have lots of clients that are pulling it. If you're sending it out to a monitor or 2 monitors, you probably don't need it. But if you are sending it out to 8, 10, 20 monitors, we've definitely used multicast to do that. The main issue that you have related to that is making sure that your network is going to support it. So a lot of times the ports and a lot of the transports that are required for multicast are not supported on the network, and that becomes problematic. It takes a little bit more work to do that. You really have to be dedicated to doing multicast and have an IT department that's dedicated to multicast to make it work. Go ahead, Grant.
If you're talking about confidence monitors as in having lots of monitors around, and that's possibly what you're saying because of the multicast, an old great way of doing it is using like the CATV conversion. So you could convert to like a coaxial, and then you can connect directly to your TVs. You can split that, you connect it into the TVs, and then you just tune in the channel. And now that works really well in big locations where you have lots of TVs all around, and you can multicast in a way that you have lots of channels. And now each one of those users on those TVs can choose what they want to be able to see, including a bunch of cable channels. So it's a really great way of doing it. It's really cheap. You're not putting another converter on at the end of the TV because it's already got that decoder built into the TV.
Next question.
Douglas Carmichael writes in, how have supply chains been lately? B&H quotes that the Yamaha DM3D console will be available in May 2024. Why would it be such a long date?
Mitchell?
Just a slight aside, it was interesting to hear Grant Perry mention that they stopped making one camera because they couldn't get parts for it.
It's a big problem. I mean, it's still a big problem, and it's still kind of working its way through the system. And so it'll be interesting. And a lot of it has to do, I think, also with a lot of cars and subsystems and other things needing the same components because of the advances in the cars and everything else. There's a larger market looking for the same things. And I think we're still recovering from, in some cases, I've heard from the AKM fire that really destroyed an entire subsystem that made this work. Courtney, real quick.
The global political situation has put a lot of pressure on chip manufacturing coming out of China. So there's a lot of boycotts and stuff going on. So that could definitely affect the supply lines.
Coming up tomorrow, we will be doing, we have panelist meetings and volunteer meetings tomorrow morning. You can see in the email that goes out, you can actually sign up, and I might put that into at everyone, just so everyone knows where it's at. But if you're interested in being a panelist, or you have questions about being a panelist, or concerns about being a panelist, or complaints about being a panelist, all of those things are great for the panelist meeting. Same thing with volunteers, concerns, questions, complaints. Those are all great for that. So that's where that is tomorrow morning. You can sign up from the email. And of course, we're covering IBC tomorrow, right after, it is taking over the show. Sorry, not right after the show, taking over the show. And we've got a little demo for you right here.
European members of the Office Hours community are heading International Broadcast Convention Rise Amsterdam to bring you the latest broadcast trends and technologies to Office Hours live from the exhibition floor. Join us on the 16th of September for the latest trends in broadcasting technologies. And this year we are especially focusing on finding solutions for your production problems. Let us know what you would like to see, what problems you need to be solved, over on officehours.global/IBC.
Not only was that a well put together video, I just have to say how much I like as a host have a 30-second break for a second. I was like, we have to do more of these videos. It's just good. Before, Bill will tell you, before that
Amen.
It's like this thing where we read the thing up and then we stop for a second and then we go to it. And I never thought about how nice it would be until our European crew put together that video. And I'm like, we have to do this all the time. I got to figure out something to put in there so that we can make that actually work. Anyway, today we're talking for the second hour. We're talking about solving network challenges. And we don't really have a presentation for this, so this is really going to be up to all of you, unless we do, and someone hasn't told me.
No, we don't. We're straight questions.
Yeah. So this is really an opportunity for you to ask questions. I think all of us have very specific questions around networking, trying to figure out how to deal with the LAN, the WAN, the VAN, the VLANs, the VLANs. I've never said VLAN before, but the VLAN. I think that I was just talking to someone about the importance of WAN-based VLANs, yesterday, and talking about why we need them and what they do and how they work. And so, but figuring out how all this connectivity works, I think is really important. And we have an incredible group of experts here that know a lot about networking today. So what I would highly recommend is, if you're listening here, is this is your opportunity. Get your questions in to here, and we'll answer your questions as we go. So please throw those in now. You can also use the QR code. You can use it. We'll keep tracking it all. Sometimes the second hour gets lost this way, but in this case, if you use the QR code here or use askofficehours.com, if you watch this later, it's not going to work for this show. Just put general questions in. But if you put them in during this hour, we'll get them into the show. So let's go ahead and jump to the first question.
Dennis Champion Walker in Radcliffe-on-Trent, UK writes in, I live in a care home where my internet connection is my iPhone's 5G. Can you recommend a router that would share my iPhone's hotspot with a local network?
There's a couple, the funny thing is that there was we used to use this. I'm trying to think of we've had things that would attach to a Wi-Fi. I know this will sound crazy, but the old airports would do it. If you had an Apple airport, or it would actually take a Wi-Fi and deliver it. Of course, your laptop will do it. So you can take a laptop and say, take my cellular in the sharing inside of a Mac, at least. And I'm sure it works on the PC as well. But in a Mac, when it says sharing, you go inside the sharing, you say, share my cellular connection with Wi-Fi or with Ethernet or what, and it'll convert those. So we've used laptops to convert those as well. Go ahead, Grant. I'm sorry, Courtney. I jumped the gun, Courtney. Go ahead.
Oh, sorry. There used to be a mode on most routers called access port extension, so that you could use it as an extender for an existing network. So you could set up the hotspot on your phone and then use it in access port extension to receive that hotspot over Wi-Fi and then extend it to other areas. Maybe that's possible still.
Go ahead, Grant.
Before I answer that question, I was just going to drop some breaking news that Andy just put in Discord, which was that Zoom is going to be integrated into vMix 27. So vMix being able to bring in Zoom participants directly into vMix, that's a pretty big deal. Anyway,
that's great. And that's really going to be great for cloud integration. So now you can have, it's going to be fine in the on-prem as well. But if you there's been a lot of lifting to serve up Zoom rooms and other things in the cloud to vMix for virtual events. And now you can just simply open up vMix. And I I don't know what the number is. I think, if I remember correctly, the number is 8 that's going to go into vMix, I believe. So so I think that it's going to be, go ahead, Grant.
Well, it's going to be interesting to see being able to just do ISO recording in the cloud too, right? Like as a backup recording, you spin up an instance of vMix, have your 4 or 5 contributors that you're doing for an event, and just let it record ISO.
Yeah.
That will be very handy, and then of course being able to switch as well. And so that anyway, back to the actual
regular
question,
scheduled program, but go ahead.
So there is a brand that is really good for kind of these little travel routers. So it's a GLINet, and they have these Wi-Fi 6 routers. I've had a few of these over the years, and this latest one I just got in a few weeks ago, and I've used it to do exactly what you're talking about, and that is I can do. It has a failover in it, right? So it has a WAN input you could take as an Ethernet, and then the USB input can have a phone or I use a 5G router that I connect to it, and then the software is really powerful to be able to do failover or even load balancing across multiple connections. And you can also, with this one, you can also share a Wi-Fi connection, which is what's particularly helpful. I use these all the time on when I go and share in a hotel. I can reshare the Wi-Fi, and then I can share it out to my Ethernet or anything that I need to. In fact, I even used it on a cruise ship, and I put it together with a USB battery in a little belt pack, and I walked around with it, and all the friends that I was with always knew I was coming close because their phones would auto connect to my Wi-Fi that was connected to the ship's Wi-Fi, and they would all get free internet off of me. So they work really well. I highly recommend those.
Way to make friends. Go ahead, Jason.
Yeah, I mean, I can explain why you don't see a lot of these. So basically the difference between a router and a switch is that a router has DHCP and NAT traversal. And I'm going to try not to get too technical here, but your iPhone, in being a hotspot, inherently becomes a router. When you have 2 routers, it becomes even more complicated to take something in, route it, then call it a gateway, then route it again and present it out again. There are a lot of ways that this can get tricky. The easiest way to do this is with the new iPhone 15, there you go, Fenwick, get the USB-C to Ethernet, and then Ethernet to any router you want. I know that's not the best answer. I think Grant already gave us the best answer, but if you wanted a little bit more background, I think that'll be about as good as you'll get.
Next question.
Bo Cordell in Charleston, South Carolina writes in, what's your practice regarding static IPs? Do you assign on the computer or create DHCP reservations on the router?
Go, Tom.
Well, whenever possible, I prefer to assign a static IP on the device itself, on the computer. If that's not possible, you can do a DHCP reservation, which of course will then make sure that that device gets the IP address that you want to assign. That's perfectly okay.
Seth?
Yeah, for me, it really depends. So generally, by default, I do prefer reservations on the router side, especially for remote equipment. That way, if something happens, it can move to another network, find an IP, I'll be able to track it down that way. However, statically programmed addresses in certain devices, especially audio and video over IP, super mission critical. I do like to program it in there, in the actual device itself. It becomes especially important for mobile kits when you are off of a router or off of a DHCP server. Otherwise, those devices probably won't find each other. Lastly, though, something I do to really save myself is when I do statically program, I like to add that in as a reservation still in the router. That way it serves as my checklist for knowing what IPs are in use on my network.
Jeff?
Good morning. My biggest question or biggest answer is also the same thing. It depends, and it depends on the workflow that you're used to. My biggest challenge in our live production work is moving gear around, and is it going to be in the same range? We recently are working on a full makeover of our IP structure for that reason that we found we had some overlaps in different places, and this is where DHCP does come into play, where it makes it a little easier to move gear from basically from system to system. We've got multiple OB trucks, like 6. So whenever you're moving things around, it helps to have DHCP enacted. But there are certain reasons that I want static IP on certain devices. And the biggest issue that I have is whenever it's DHCP, if I can't find it just by doing a Angry IP search, which is a great little software to scan your network and see what's out there. If I can't find it, then I'm just in Never Land looking for it. But with static IP, I can actually see. The thing is, I don't want all my employees to have access to my router. So yeah, the IT guys like Seth's probably going, well, just look at the router. But yeah, if you have control to it, I don't want to give that control to everybody. So I have them look at a sticker. Oh, look, there's the address. 30.1201 12. Okay, then I go back to a computer and say, okay, ping ... 30.12. There it is. It's working. Okay, it's a problem somewhere else. So it depends on your infrastructure, how much gear you have, how big your subnets are. It takes more. We've grown a lot in the last 2 years, so now we're having to expand our reach quite a bit.
Yeah, we at one time we had about 9 or 10 kits that were floating around the world, but every time they came back in, they were just reabsorbed into the warehouse and then rebuilt as they went out for specific kits. And because of that movement, we really found that working with DHCP was a lot easier with reservations because all the reservations were in all the Meraki's that we were using. And so you just plug in a switcher and it would just automatically give it the IP. So all you had to tell me is what kit you were in. And I knew what the IP, what number was for everything in that kit immediately. And I just knew that there's going to be one octet that was different. The rest of them are all going to be the same. And so it was, and that made it much, much easier for us to manage over time. We always then reserve a certain section inside of that inside of the host addresses for statics. So it'd be 50 to 100 addresses that are sitting there that are protected so that if we have things that need to be static or that we want to be static, we know where to put them so that there's a place open for that as opposed, so the DHCP worked all around that. Next question.
Eric Kurz in Hartford, Connecticut writes in, what are various networking approaches to reaching thousands of on-premises employees with a live webinar? What are the advantages and disadvantages to each method, and what are the costs?
Go ahead, Jeff. I can't hear you, Jeff.
It was quieter last time. All right. It doesn't really matter on the cost because there's way too much just to say, oh, it's going to cost $5,000 because that is a huge open-ended question. The thing about live webinars is everybody is like, oh, it's on the internet. We'll just go to the internet. We'll use the internet, i.e. web, whatever it happens to be, whether it's Zoom, Teams, or even good old-fashioned YouTube. When that happens, you're using bandwidth. And they're planning whenever they book bandwidth, they're not planning on X amount of bandwidth per X amount of persons to be live streaming the whole time. They're planning on, I'm getting whatever bandwidth I have available and I can afford and budget at this time. Everything else is just whatever we have. So that is whenever they do, and I've dealt with this multiple times, like, oh, well, we have 100 people at this branch. And it was a DSL modem, which is like, 1 meg. It's like, well, of course they're not going to be able to see it. It's just stuttering. It's like, well, everybody's trying to watch it. I've had this happen in fairly large events, even with Zoom, that everybody's trying to watch it. So the thing is on site, proper networking that can handle multicast, which is a higher end switch. It's not your $50 switch from Best Buy. It's a higher end switch. It needs to be able to handle multicasting, which is just on the local network. Then the distribution side from the public is you have to be able to manage that. So you have to be able to get it into a venue. Say if you're going to a branch office, you need to get that into the venue and then manage multicasting in that spot for that 100 people or 50 people or 20 people. 20 people could bring down a branch office. So it just all depends on the number of people that are trying to see it, but it's not as simple as it seems.
Go ahead, Grant.
Yeah, I would just research for Zoom if you want to use Zoom. The Zoom Mesh was a new feature that they announced at Zoomtopia last year, and that is specifically for webinar is like an eCDN product, and so it actually makes the client, the Zoom client, reserve it over the local network to up to a bunch of clients on the local network. So it's actually dividing your outside bandwidth by a lot. And so it's kind of like a BitTorrent almost, like it's a peer-to-peer sharing within the local network, and it's actually really simple to set up once you've got it all turned on. If you can find the settings all within the web portal of Zoom, you find the right settings and hold your mouth right, then it'll work. And that's what's it's worth looking into. And I think like Cisco's, like their WebEx and all those, they all have some similar things to being able to do this because it's a common problem in modern offices. Of course, the best way to do it is just move everyone to remote and they can all be at home. It's no problem.
Use their own bandwidth. It actually has become less of a problem. I actually talked to someone a couple weeks ago about this, that because all the employees aren't at home, they found that the headquarters, everyone could just watch the stream without too much impact. They were like, when it's not clustered so densely, it works actually pretty well. One of the companies that has been doing this the longest is called Collective. They used to be called Contiki, and they've been around for probably, 15 or 20 years. And they do a peer-to-peer solution, and that has been something that they do. They've got a lot of pretty good dashboards and setups, and they were probably the ones that really all we used for this kind of thing 15 years ago was Contiki, which now is Collective. Then they've gotten a lot better. They were a little rough around the edges until they became Collective and got some investment, and they became a little bit more stable. But there's, I know that Facebook Workplace had built that into it. Zoom builds it into it. The largest companies that we work with, the problem is that it's your gateway to the outside world that's the problem. You oftentimes have enough internal network if you're a really large company to stream a lot of this data. And they may use multicast, but a lot of the larger companies sometimes build their own, basically a CDN inside of the company that is having root and then all the edge servers. So you're the origin servers, and you end up streaming externally to Akamai or something like that, and internally to an origin server that's within the company. And the company has its own edge servers that are designed for that location. That turns out to be, from an IT perspective, more acceptable than multicast for a lot of these companies for a variety of reasons. And so they build that basically building exactly what Akamai has, but inside the companies to make that actually happen. And then it's not impacting their bandwidth going out to the rest of the world. It's just a CPU problem at that point. So, and then what they usually do there is they'll put that in a system by which the internal users just go to the regular web page, but when it sees that you're coming through when you're coming through the network, it automatically just sees that you're inside the building, and it hands you the video from the right place to make that actually happen. So that's where I'm talking Fortune 100 or bigger that will do those kinds of things, because it does take a little bit of understanding of live streaming to make that work. Next question.
Robert Sababady in Piastov, Poland writes in, my first router has DHCP switched on, and it is connected to the backup WAN port on the second router, which also has DHCP enabled with static IPs for all connected devices. When WAN 1 on the second router fails, I lose internet access. Why?
Jason?
Oh boy, there could be a number of reasons for this. I think what it has to do with is that you have misattributed your routing tables, and your router is entirely and completely confused. It is also, I will add, made entirely way worse by the fact that one has Wi-Fi and the other one doesn't have Wi-Fi. When you're using failover and expecting failover to fail over, you need exactly the same statics for exactly the same devices or exactly the same DHCP settings. If you end up with both or even one misconfiguration, you're going to get all sorts of problems. So you're not losing internet access. What you're doing is confusing your router with two different routing tables.
Grant?
Yeah, there's probably a really technical reason for how it's happening, but my experience is that WAN ports with DHCP, with multiple DHCP servers running, will confuse each other, and your whole network will stop working. That's what I've found. And so my experience, I don't like failover necessarily. I prefer to be able to choose my what's the
gateway?
My
priority?
hosts or the gateway. Thank you, gateway. I like to be able to choose my gateways per device, right? So what I end up doing is I have my main fiber internet comes in, and that's serving everything by default. And then I have some 5G routers that hang off the back of my house that kind of point straight at the tower, and I have them set to static. So the DHCP is turned off, the server is turned off, and then I have the IP static, and then I can choose that as my gateway on individual machines, and it works perfectly. And now I can sort of load balance myself, manually load balance across different internet connections, and that works really nicely. And I'm not confusing my network trying to have multiple WANs that have multiple DHCP servers and confusing it all.
Go ahead, Jeff.
I'm going to have to say this, Grant, that is a inventive way of doing it. You do things different down there. Okay. First thing, I just kind of took this question apart, and I noticed you have one router connected into another router. Stop that. Don't do that. So it sounds like you're daisy chaining things. Yeah, don't do that. If you have, as many of us in the U.S. have, like a Comcast cable modem or any cable modem, they're usually trying to be a router themselves. You can call them and have them set it to bypass mode. They may call it something and pass through, bypass something another. You want that modem just to be a dumb modem, and then have a router like a Peplink or even a Unify or something, that a gateway that you can control everything through. I think that's probably the first thing I would do. Now, when it comes to your backup, if you have WAN 1, if you have two different WAN inputs coming in, Peplinks, and really fell in love with, you can do exactly what Grant is doing kind of around the way, is you could actually assign certain WANs to certain inputs or certain LAN connections. And so you could say, I want my server only to use the fiber, but I want my desktop machines only to use the cable modem. And then you could also cross those back and forth too, if you needed to have some other backup options and stuff. But get rid of two routers. That's bad. Bad.
I will say at venues, we see two routers all the time, because the venue has its own router and we have a router for our own system. So and a lot of this is doing exactly what you're talking about, which is defining it just has to be a network that is defining that correctly. I don't know if it's bad because it's inevitable, but it is definitely something that you have to manage and have somebody managing carefully. Next question.
Bo Cordell in Charleston, South Carolina writes in, has anyone else deployed an NSM like Security Onion to capture and monitor network traffic?
All I can say before I go to John here is that, why didn't I think of that name? It's so great. Security Onion. And they didn't really take advantage of it. I mean, it should be like this hard-plated onion thing that is like, looks like I don't know. Anyway, go ahead, John.
Been using Wireshark for years. It's fun. You want to lose a whole day of productivity, load Wireshark and start playing with it.
Next, go ahead, John. Jason, sorry.
I just wanted to add that the Onion comes from the Onion router, which of course is the quintessential way to get onto the dark web. So that's the namesake behind that.
Next question.
Ed Wilcock in Grand Rapids, Michigan writes in, is anyone currently using ST2110 workflows? What are the pain points? What are the costs for the networking infrastructure? Any advice in terms of the networking for people considering ST2110?
Jeff?
I have an Arista switch sitting in my rack. It cost a little over $10,000. That was the cheapest way in that I found. So it costs a lot, unfortunately. And it's a lot of pain. NDI is way easier.
Go ahead, John.
Yeah, we got a tour from it was Guy actually. We got a tour from one of the NFL trucks. They're using Cisco 100 gig backbone routers, and those are about 100,000. I think Netgear's announced the 100 gig switches. I think they're about $18,000. One 1080p stream at 30 frames is going to be over 1 gigabit per second. So you're going to need at least 100 gig backbone.
I mean, it depends on how many cameras, of course, and how many throughputs that you're pushing through for 2110. But you probably 40 is probably the minimum. Like if you're going to do a 2110 installation, that's entry level. So you are talking some real money to get into this stuff. It's similar to SDI costs, for what we're doing. But it is. So I think that's the in the overall. But it depends on how many signals that you're going. Like that truck, I don't even know how many. I mean, it's an incredible amount of signals that are going back and forth with that truck. I admit that I think that 2110 has a pretty interesting future. I wouldn't build a truck with it. So I think that I've seen the trucks coming out, and I think that they're all still working through it. so it's a lot of incredible amount of damage. And the problem that happened in the past is people were building these studios on 2110. There's a couple in San Francisco that built on 2110. And the issue that they got into was that the compatibility was really a problem because they have all the substructures, but now they got to convert everything in and out of 2110. So until all those external devices really come into play, it's not necessarily viable. Next question.
Robert Sababady is back from Piastov, Poland. Networking, is there a smart way to minimize the switchover time in a Cisco or Netgear dual WAN router to a minimum, but to avoid losing packets switching back and forth? Alex, yesterday I was referred to you with this question.
Go, Jeff.
For us, it made us move from the Unified platform into Peplink. And Peplink, we actually have their SpeedFusion, which is leveraged in that. So it actually has active connections at all times bonded together. They call it SpeedFusion VPN or SpeedFusion bonding. Any of those. Matter of fact, our buddy Blue over in Charleston now, in his studio, we set up, and that was one of the first Peplink deployments we did. We were on... Matter of fact, with a guy here somewhere, we were on a call with him and we were doing a test in Zoom. It was seamless, never once dropped. And that's what you want, right? You want backup not to be downtime. And so it all depends on the implementation and what happens. With Unify, we had we had, like I said, multiple trucks, Unify rigs everywhere. It was 20 to 30 seconds. It was painful to me, and I was losing money. So I had to look for another opportunity for a different set of gear that would always be live and that I could always count on it switching over fast.
Jason?
I don't have much to add to that. You can you need to be able to double the packets going out if you want absolutely no packets lost straight away. If you're just looking for failover, use an edge router and program it very carefully.
Next question.
Bo Cordell in Charleston, South Carolina writes in, is anyone else capturing and displaying network metrics and logs with something like Prometheus, Loki, or Grafana?
I think we need Bo on the show.
Absolutely.
With this crew of yours. Yeah, go ahead, Jeff.
I'm still waiting for Bo to give me a call and give me a tutorial on Grafana and how to make it work, because I installed it and I was just like, okay, it's installed, and now what? Because it's huge, big things, lots of fun, but hard.
Bo, come on the show. Next question.
Eric Hertz in Hartford, Connecticut writes in, since multicast no longer floods by default and nearly all routers and switchers support it, why don't more organizations use it for internal live video distribution?
Seth?
So IGMP snooping is generally the feature that the switch has to support in order to manage multicast. And it's not always enabled by default on switches. Certainly unmanaged switches do not have or can support IGMP snooping. The other thing that also happens is when it is enabled on a switch, the defaults can often stay in place. And when you have multiple switches that are all in their default configuration, it has to figure out which one is going to be the primary IGMP querier in order to actually support the multicast network. Sometimes what happens is the least powerful switch becomes the primary, and then you end up with multicast management issues. So long story short, it's not always by default going to be friendly on a network. Lastly is the usability factor. So if this is in an organization where you have employees, office workers, who are pulling up this multicast feed, it doesn't really exist in a web browser. You have to use something like VLC or, a more advanced video player in order to see that multicast stream. And, well, you might have to explain that to the people in the office in terms of how to do that.
Good, Courtney.
And just for my own education, does multicast always use UDP, or can it use TCP/IP protocol, or does it just use UDP? Anybody?
Usually UDP, because it's a flood, and it will flood without acknowledgement, unlike TCP.
I think that beyond any technical limitations, there is a huge cultural within IT departments. There is a huge cultural disincentive to use any kind of multicast unless they've designed for it, built for it. I mean, oftentimes it's taken us for companies when we used to do a lot of the Contiki/collective work. It would be weeks of testing, weeks of process, weeks of security, weeks of it was from the time we were going to do it, and we didn't bring it in. It would be the companies decided to do this, and we're running tests against that. And it would take, oftentimes 2 to 3 months for them to build what they were happy with to allow that. That was years ago, but you have to remember that there's beyond the technology, there's a cultural leaning or bias towards I don't want to deal with that. So the companies that have done it, Arenas, generally their networks are very built for multicast because they use it for all the monitors. And so they have an entire VLAN, a network that's all built around, sometimes even a copper network that's just built around multicast to get monitors supplied with that video. Next question.
Juan C. Robles in CDMX Mexico writes in, how do you manage convenience versus security when building network infrastructure?
Jason?
Okay. The first answer is hire an expert and don't be the expert if you're asking. The second part of this is understand your gateway and don't let your gateway be your router. If you have a cable modem, don't get the monolith, rely on the monolith you got from Comcast or whomever, and just get your own thing. That way their setup stops exactly at the gateway. Second thing is turn off UPnP. Third thing is if turning off UPnP breaks things, please hire an expert.
All I'll say is that you have 3 circles. You have security, and you have cost, and you have convenience, and you get to pick 2. That's the way we fix that is by using Meraki, which is really expensive, especially in some cases where you might have thousands of units in place. So there's a subscription cost. It's probably the most convenient and most secure together that you can get, but it's the most expensive version of that, and that's from Cisco. But you got to pick one. You got to decide which one you're going to do in that process. Next question.
Jesse Mills in the San Francisco Bay Area writes in, how do you decide when to use VLAN when setting PTP, flow control, QoS, and other settings?
Jeff?
Well, QoS is something that's been around for a while. Quality of service is what QoS stands for, in case you were wondering. QoS was implemented back when we had 10 meg networks. You needed to be able to control everything. You needed to be able to choke a certain amount of traffic to go down a certain pipe. Even in 100 base, they were still oversaturated. We started adding in VoIP, and you started adding in, now our streaming feeds and things like that. So QoS was an older technology. It's not as necessary anymore, especially in a production network. If you're in a production network, you really need to be looking at a very high quality gigabit infrastructure, or better, 10 gig. It's affordable. Better to go ahead and go that route. You don't have to worry about a lot of these other small settings if you have adequate speed in your network. The PTP, it depends on the protocols that you're using. If you don't have something that's more advanced, you probably don't even have to worry about the PTP. But I personally am leaning towards the Netgear M4250 and now 4350s, are where we're moving into some of our larger switches and our cores. Those are just managed already, and they have their own settings that are common to our network. So we have a Dante profile, we click the Dante profile. If we have NDI, we want to assign that to a certain VLAN. If we want to separate the two, we just click it, and then they take care of all the settings for you. You don't have to go in and monkey it down to the very, 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 very fine details anymore. That's basically my point, is you don't really need to go in and tweak it if you are using tools that already support it.
Next question.
Henry Ramos in Yonkers, New York writes in my NIC under advanced TCP v4 settings, I like to add a second subnet to communicate with a static IP devices like PTZ cams. Any possible issue with this method?
Jason?
Oh yeah, all sorts of problems with this. I will trust the Windows networking stack to do more than one thing with one NIC about this far. I think you are much, much, much better off, because you're not going to get persistent connections to both subnets, assigning one subnet per NIC and going along with your day. It's inexpensive, and the potential backlash is catastrophic.
Jeff?
I was just going to say a simpler network design would be able to use better routers, switches in place. Try to do less on the computer. Just have it connect to just one connection, one VLAN, one certain area, instead of trying to do so much in the computer. Because if the computer dies, yeah, sometimes that happens. If the computer dies, then you have to go back and remember, what did I do to that NIC to make it work? And it's just better to have it in the switch infrastructure.
Grant?
If the computer dies, especially PCs, right, Jeff? You know, you've got to really worry about that.
All right. I deserve that.
I would say it just comes back to the initial one of the earlier questions when we were talking about DHCP reservations and things, right? Like if you, I think because I got a PTZ, I've got a few PTZ cameras, and I've had them set to static, and I've had them, I've tried different scenarios, and always the best is just having it on DHCP. And I know the MAC address, and I set it up in the router that it connects to, and it just works. And then I can use a great tool on the Mac called Remote Desktop, and that will show me all the devices that are sitting on that on the network, and away it goes. So what you're trying to do kind of circumvents that and try to get back into DHCP where the network sees everything and assigns the IPs, and away it works. So that's what I suggest for that.
Next question.
Eric Hers in Hartford, Connecticut writes in, how important is FEC for multicast broadcasting, especially on Wi-Fi with normal packet loss?
Normal packet loss for Wi-Fi is disastrous. It's actually worse than cellular. So I would say that you absolutely need FEC for Wi-Fi. Whether you need FEC for multicast over a completely wired network, I don't know. I don't know if you absolutely need it. I'd probably put it in anyway. But for Wi-Fi, you absolutely need it. Wi-Fi is probably, I would guess, 1/5 to 1/10 as stable as cellular to deliver packets regularly. We see this all the time when people join this show over Wi-Fi. You'll see what we call micro stalls all the time. Like all the time. It's coming in. It does matter a little bit on the caching side of things, but FEC is, I would never try to do multicast without FEC over Wi-Fi. Next question.
Robert Sababady in Piastov, Poland writes in, how much internet bandwidth does Zoom ISO require per 1080 output channel? NDI requires 120 megabits per second in the LAN, but what does that equate to with respect to internet bandwidth?
Well, for Zoom ISO, for the 1080p, just the Zoom ISO itself, I believe it's about 6.25 megabits per second is the bandwidth requirement. That's what we've observed going through that. It might be somewhere between 6 and 6.5, but pretty close to 6.25. That's not a number that we were given. That's just a number we see when we're working and when we do the multiplication, for it. So that's for a 1080p stream. That's what we experience. Next question.
Danny Grizzle in Longview, Texas writes in, I want to build a mobile package to live stream regularly from rural locations via bonded cell data connections. Planning to wirelessly link multiple cameras to an ATEM Mini. Latency is not a big thing. I keep coming back to Teradek. Prism Flex. Workable?
Jeff?
I'm personally not a fan of the Teradek platform. I've tried it multiple times to different versions, different products, and just never really been happy with it. It kind of confused on if you're doing multiple cameras wirelessly. That's one thing, but to separate that from what we're kind of talking more about today is on bonded cellular and the infrastructure for that. Absolutely, you can do that. I would start with something if you need something simple and just drop down and you're ready to go. Talk to Keenan Campbell. He was going to be on the panel with us today. Keenan, disaster recovery, is that disaster pros?
Disastergroup.us.
All right, I know he's a disaster. He deals with disaster recovery and other disasters. He provides a modem based, a multi-modem based router that you just drop down, plug in, play. It's simple. It is similar to what we use in our PepLink infrastructure, and we use Starlinks, which, by the way, for those that have been sitting on the fence, PepLink has a new firmware coming out very soon that natively supports the Starlink directly plugged in. Can't wait, because I don't have to do multiple steps for that. But we've done the bonding thing. We've been on the side of mountains doing multiple cellulars. We've done multiple Starlinks, been in the middle of a lake bed somewhere, getting dirty doing it. But there's a lot of solutions to do that. I'll stay away from Speedify. I'll call them straight out because I don't feel like, I think it's voodoo magic that they're telling you they're bonding. I don't think they really are as the same way. My go-to, without a doubt, is LiveView if it counts, meaning I'm getting paid for it. I want to use LiveView. I use PepLink bonding just for my internet. That's it. I don't stream through it necessarily, but I do use LiveView and its bonding capabilities because it's stable and it just works.
Yeah, in full disclosure, LiveView is lending us an LU800 that we use for the conferences, and we've been doing lots of testing with HDR and 4K out of it. We're really happy with it, but I used to lease 2 LiveViews for a decade, which were the LU600s that we used all over the United States, and then rented them when we were overseas. And I will agree with Jeff that the LiveViews are the thing that just works. So if you start to put other things together, we have done this with PepLinks, we have done this with Teradeks, and none of them worked as stably as a LiveView, and that's why we're using them for the conferences as well. Go ahead, Grant.
I was going to mention Speedify as a recommendation, but now I feel a little sheepish about saying that. I have used it for live streaming, and it seems to have worked very well for me. I don't use it a lot, but I have it in as an entry level option to just get a stream working across multiple connections, and particularly when those connections are the same. When I've had sort of the same carrier, where I've some 5G connections, and I use the same 3 or 4 of the same on the same account, and that's where I've had great success, and it's worked really well, and it's just kind of doubled or tripled my upload bandwidth, and away it goes. But I take Jeff's lead on understanding exactly what it's doing. So
good, Jeff.
I just wanted to follow that up. I agree that it's a way to get started. I just don't feel like it's a solution for my needs. I'm getting paid dollars, and I'm getting paid dollars to deliver. And so I want to make sure that my feed is going out as reliably as possible whenever we're getting paid to do that. I would say there is something to be said about when you're bonding and you have that one guy, say Verizon, which seems to be my guy, that's only like 0.1 upload, and then everybody else is like at 5 meg. Those bond great, but when you have that one guy out there, this is where the bonding technology really shines, like LiveView, because it knows, hey, this guy's slow over here. I don't want to mess with him. I don't want to send stuff through him. I want to route the traffic through the good holes. And Starlink is the same way, because you can have holes as the satellites are moving over. You could have switchover between satellites, especially in the very beginning of Starlink when we were using it out of the lake bed. We had a couple of times that it dropped out, but we were using 2 different Starlinks, and we tried to start them so that the holes would overlap between each other. But you are, especially in the PepLink world too, that's one thing about their SpeedFusion is you're going to be held down to that lowest common denominator. So you have to be careful about using the more inexpensive bonding solutions that are out there because of that. They'll try to say, oh, well, let's just kind of limit everything down to 2 meg because the fastest thing is 2 meg. Well, it's 2 meg, but it's only 2 meg, and that's it. So you're not going to get anything more out of it, and then you're going to be hitting drops out of that one because it's maxed out, while the other ones might have 5 meg. Collectively, you could get a 4 or 5 meg out because you have multiples that are well over what you actually need. So that's kind of the thing that LiveU just does for you. So better solutions for that reason.
Next question.
Eric Hertz in Hartford, Connecticut writes in, nearly all encoders support multicast's output. Why not use your encoder as a multicast source so no servers are required for live video distribution across your entire network?
This gets back into, I mean, if you're talking about what I had spoken about before, it gets back into a sensitivity around multicast. And so the ability to just throw some servers in to make that actually happen, because in the grand scheme of things, in a large corporation, let's say you have 10,000 people on campus, it's a very small live streaming number. It doesn't take that much of an edge to support. We have done multicast for up to 30,000 over Wi-Fi, and that has worked pretty well. But that's a pretty dedicated architecture for only that one thing. In a larger corporation, oftentimes they're more apt to just solve the problem without changing much of the infrastructure. Next question.
Henry Ramos in Yonkers, New York writes in, is there anything simpler to use than Wireshark to check network traffic?
Jeff?
There's a great tool coming out. It's not out just yet, but for checking NDI traffic and Dante traffic on your network, or actually multiple things on your network. It's from a friend of mine named Pablo. He is in Dallas, and he's writing a software for AV Sono, and AV Sono is his company, and he does several different things for NDI, but he has a monitoring solution that's coming out. It'll tell you strength between connections, between devices, between PCs, Macs, whatever, and it'll show you your overall bandwidth that you're being used. I can't wait to get my hands on deploying it in much larger setups.
Go, Jason.
Boy, I can't wait either. And I just found out about it. Yeah, there is only one thing that's easier, and it is if you have a professional level router, your router can capture and check a considerable amount of your network traffic. Keep in mind, I know Jeff doesn't love Ubiquiti. Jeff's scale is insane, okay? Like people don't think like just how much bandwidth Jeff is pushing. I've not had issues with professional Ubiquiti switches. He has. I've also never plugged 10 NDIs into anything. So, you know, that is what it is.
I just found out that there's a Shark Fest. Wireshark has its own conference called Shark Fest, October 30th to November 3rd. We have to find out how to send somebody to Shark Fest. That's all. And see how many fins we can find. Next question.
Ed Wilcock in Grand Rapids, Michigan writes in, on show sites, are you segregating your device control traffic from your VoIP signal traffic? For example, Shure Control and Dante on the Axenet system, or letting them coexist? What is your preferred method?
I think it's the Axient system. Go ahead, Grant.
Yeah, we've done both. So we've got a setup with 6 racks that do across convention center rooms, with Constellation racks and TF rack, Yamaha TF rack with Dante running over it, and we just recently changed it to have dedicated NICs for Dante, and also a totally separate network for all of the Dante network, and we've just found that everything works better, so the general network has works nicer as well, and we can do some heavier internet syncing and data transfer and all of that without a concern that the Dante network is going to get affected by any of that when we do it across 6 and do it all on one network. So we have found that separating it out has worked really well for us.
Jeff?
I believe in separation also, and for that factor, it's just it makes things work better. But we did have Unify working for a while, but it just, we grew out of it. As Jason said, when you start doing 10, 15, 20 different NDI feeds across one machine, and then I've got multiple machines, that's where things start breaking down with some of the less expensive switching networks. But yeah, I like keeping things separated so that way I can address, I know where the issue is. I can see, oh, it's in the Dante network, I need to work in that. If you have it all flat, if your whole network is flat, it's a lot more work. So that's why I use it.
Yeah, we minimum have VLAN for our Dante networks. Oftentimes, when we built them for large events that matter, uh, entirely different copper network. Like it's not like they don't touch each other. Like the Dante lives in its own world because we just can't afford to have anything impinge on what it's doing. Next question.
Tim Gross in Pleasant Hill writes in, extending iPhone Wi-Fi. Look up Amazon GL. I bet many routers have this on WAN port. Tether for WAN port.
I think
that was an earlier question. I think he was trying to follow up and help Dennis. One of the first questions. Yeah.
Yeah. Next question.
Steve Uros in Madison, Wisconsin writes in, does PepLink bonding have any latency impacts on video conferencing or VoIP?
Jeff?
Not that I've seen. It's the solution. Absolutely.
And I will disagree with Jeff. It's a disaster. So the problem the problem is the jitter that goes on between the bonding. It causes all kinds of breakup. We've had this problem with PepLinks and any kind of bonding. We never bond if we're doing open WebRTC ever. The reframing of those things, we can see it all the time. So that is definitely the one thing we never do is to bond connection for a WebRTC connection after hundreds of attempts to make this work. We've definitely we definitely don't do it anymore. And the reality is usually most cell coverage.
Fight.
In most locations, their cell coverage is fine. And we find that a cellular connection is better than a bonded connection when it comes specifically to WebRTC. As soon as you go to SRT, anything else that has any kind of forward air correction or anything that's there, but the jitter itself with WebRTC just doesn't mix. And we've had that problem for a decade. Next question.
Douglas Carmichael writes in, when would you want to use a dedicated Dante audio interface like the Yamaha RUIO 16D instead of DVS?
Jason?
If you're getting paid for it. Anytime you're getting paid for it, you will not use Dante Virtual Sound Card. If you want to learn Dante, use Dante's Virtual Sound Card. I'm sure that other people have had great luck with it, but I will never use a software solution when a hardware solution exists in production or something that I'm getting paid to do.
Go, Jeff.
I have 60 licenses of DVS. We use it daily. It works. You just have to know where to use it and how to use it. A proper Dante network makes a difference. It does, without a doubt. If you have a proper switch network and everything works, Dante's Dante at that point. And maybe it's because I use PCs. I don't know, maybe, but it just works for me.
We definitely think that it's gotten better. I think that we definitely had an opinion a couple of years ago, up to about 3 or 4 years ago, that we weren't going to put mission critical things on it. And again, we're on a Mac, it could be different. But on at least on a Mac, we found it to not be totally stable. But we've used it. We've used DVS for a decade, and in general, we didn't use it for. We used it for contribution, but not core video audio. And sometimes it was just simpler to do it that way. Go ahead, Tom.
Yeah, on a PC, I agree. On a Mac, maybe not so much. It's not as stable.
You go, Grant.
Before I had a Dante bit of hardware, DVS was next to useless, right? And same with, I wouldn't even touch Dante VIA. Like that whole thing is, terrible. As soon as I added a piece of hardware that has the clock in it, the Dante clock, onto the network, everything just sat beautifully and starts working. So I got an X32 with a Dante card, and now all of the Macs that I run, I can run 16 channels in and out. I do a whole bunch of stuff. It works beautifully, and so I'm hearing you well through DVS right now, and this is my audio sending out through DVS. It was a little while ago now, but they did an update for the Apple Silicon, and it just works really well now. So it's probably better than PC.
It is. It is imperative that you have a piece of you have a Dante hardware device on the network. You cannot use DVS without it. Next question.
Andrew Lipnick in San Francisco writes in, for live events, Dante is physically isolated from other production networks. Is there a workflow where it is advantageous to have Dante as part of a larger network?
Good, Jeff.
I see zero person. I don't want to have my Dante traffic part of a larger network that everybody else can see. Zero reason.
Go ahead, Grant.
I guess larger, like that's relative, right? So I've got my network here, and I have it all running on the same network. And the main reason is that I don't want to do a bunch of separate network cards, and I want to do all of that stuff. And I've got all of the machines that I have running. I have some 10 gig, like the Mac Studio that this is running is on a 10 gig network card, and it works great. And it's all Unify routing, and everything just sits and works nicely. But it's not a large network. So when I was talking about the conferences, we definitely separated it all out. All in here, it's all together and co-mingles nicely.
Jason?
Perhaps you should think of Dante as a substitute for a lot of analog patch cabling. And if you think of it that way, and somebody comes up after, here you are at the event, plugging in your Dante stuff, or if you're plugging in an analog mixer and someone says, hey, I'd really like for this to be part of a far larger patch panel of XLR cables, would you say yes? If the answer is yes, you're crazy.
We don't even connect. I mean, to put it in perspective, if we're going to record a bunch of stuff from, like at a big venue, we actually use analog to go between the two. If we have a Dante network and they have a Dante network, we don't try to have any kind of, we just say, hey, let's do an analog patch. And so we literally patch it so that there's no clocking issues. Maddie and Dante are great. But if you're especially in a real heterogeneous, fast moving venue, like a festival or something like that, bridging between the two with analog cables, really short ones, away from power is really useful. Next question.
Douglas Carmichael writes in, would the Yamaha DM3D be a cost-effective choice of console to start entering the Dante ecosystem?
I would say, it would be. I think that, as we said, it's backordered forever. So I think that is going to be the real problem. Right now, what we use primarily as that entry level position is the X32 rack. And that's where I think that's the lowest cost one that I know of that we put a Dante card into. So I think but that's how we start. A lot of our smaller stuff when we're putting things together tends to be that, and then we move up from there. Next question.
Jesse Mills in the San Francisco Bay Area writes in, I know overestimating for a switch backplane would be ideal. How much overhead is necessary for broadcast AV or similar?
Jeff?
The basics of marketing, of course, are going to blow this out. Sometimes believe it or not, manufacturers have been known to enhance their marketing spill. So if you take the number of ports that you have on a switch, say a 24-port switch, they're gigabit ports, double that's usually where a lot of them will land. But this is where it gets a little bit particular. It's like there are certain silver boxes, that are switches, that actually have certain things that they say they're rated for. But what you don't know is how many controllers are in each one of those port structures. They may be sharing it across 6 or 12 different ports. It could be just one. The Arista that I have in the rack back there is just humming away. It's per port. It's got more power in it. So that's kind of the things as you escalate in your network infrastructure. Those are certain things you need to kind of look at and ask those really hard questions. It's like, how is the infrastructure inside that switch? How is that? Because it starts to make a difference after a while.
Go ahead, Seth.
So especially be cognizant of port speed, especially when you're planning ahead. So do you eventually need 10 gig uplinks, 25 gig, 40 gig uplinks? So think about that and add that into the math of the switch backplane as well to ensure that there's sufficient bandwidth. And one other item too, plan for PoE and plan ahead for that. A lot of the Panasonic PTZs require PoE++. So you also want to look at your total power budget as part of the switch in and of itself too, to be sure it can handle that load down the road. Later on down the line.
My general rule for all things related to production is a 40 to 60% headroom. That's labor, power, internet, everything. Next question.
Douglas Carmichael writes in, I went to a concert at a local theater and they were using Grand MA2 on PC for lighting control instead of a proper dedicated lighting console. From a security fault tolerance perspective, isn't it better to use a dedicated device per function?
You know, the real advantage of appliances is that you're not tempted to do other things on them. They don't have a bunch of other things going on. If you treat your PC like an appliance and it just runs the thing it's supposed to run, then it works great. If you start using it as a multi-use PC or Mac or anything else that we're starting to run lots of processes, then it becomes unstable. So it just depends on how you. It's not the PC itself. If that PC doesn't do anything else, but if they're checking email and uploading and downloading from FTP and is going to YouTube and doing a bunch of other stuff, then that PC becomes less and less stable. But if you treat it like an appliance, there should be no reason why it's not stable. The real advantage of a Grand MA is that you have lots of dials and sliders and things that you can use and you can move faster. The interface on the PC is going to be a lot more sluggish than what you get on a piece of hardware. That was a great second hour. So I want to really thank all the panelists for being here, but especially our network experts for being here for this troubleshooting second hour. Hopefully we'll do these regularly. Probably not every month, but at least every quarter to kind of fill in gaps as people are working through that stuff. So thank you so much for our networking experts for joining us and being part of the conversation, and our general panelists for the general conversation. A great Black Magic conversation in the first hour. It was kind of fun. I think that these kind of post-production or post-keynote second or first hours is kind of fun if we have enough questions. It was kind of organic, so it worked really well. So thank you very much. And thank you to the producers for all the great questions today, both in the first hour and the second hour, really making a great conversation. It really is up to all of you watching, the producers, to either use the QR code or use Mokana and get your questions in, because that drives the entire conversation. It makes a huge difference for you to be asking questions. It's not like a minor thing, like we're just happy to help. We need you. We need you to ask questions. So you don't have to ask lots of questions, but like a question a day from everyone watching, and we would not have any problem at all filling a show. So anyway, write those questions down. But you can use the askofficehours.com any time of the day. So if you think about it, just think about it. You go, oh, I'm just going to ask a question. You just throw it right in. You don't have to wait for us to reset or to get up in the morning. You can put it in any time, and we'll see it in the morning. So go ahead and take advantage of that. Thanks to the great crew on the back end that makes all of this possible. We've got this incredible development crew that makes this is not your vanilla Zoom. And so there's a great team that makes this actually turn into a production. There's a team that's managing all of our guests and what we're talking about. There's a council that talks about what we're going to talk about. There's an incredible team putting those pieces together. And then finally, of course, there's a team actually switching and making all of this happen. And we really appreciate all of your contributions. We traveled, drum roll please, I think it was pretty, I thought we'd go over 100K. 95,000 miles, 153,000 kilometers, and that is 756 million bananas for scale. All right, let's go ahead and jump into After Hours.
Oh, I just stepped on my Windows 11 networking stack.
I think it went from no one knowing like most people didn't know what bananas for scale was, and then now we're slowly making sure that some relatively obscure Reddit comment is
single-handedly bringing it back again.
But we have the difference is we have a standardized banana.
Yeah, the key enabling technology is right there in your hand.
You don't have to buy a new one every week. Yeah,
exactly. It's always a different size.
You need a chip chart and a standardized banana to be on this panel.
Is that banana?
Pray
or is it
we
banana-ish?
never move to plantains.
Plantains for scale.
Be the equivalent of metric imperial.
Get a lot more plantains per mile.
I know, exactly.